This programme contains strong language. The incredible thing about a pop song is just how far it can travel. Consider this trajectory. A song begins its life in a makeshift recording studio, set up in the master bedroom of a one-time family home in Surrey. It weaves its way to a small city in Colorado, some 4,500 miles away. There, it ends up in the ears of someone who needs to hear it. A kid called Garen Michael.
When I was 16, I was working in a restaurant, and I just remember whenever that would come on the radio, because back in the kitchen they would have the radio going, and I just would stop working and I couldn't leave the room until the song was over. There's just something so inspiring and deep about that song that just hooked me.
Years later, when Garen finds out more about the circumstances in which the song was written, he'll begin to understand the connection that he felt.
That was like my senior year of high school. But there was just something about I think that period in his life where he was going through a divorce and writing really heartfelt songs. And I was a very sensitive kid and had a lot of pain in my life.
It's the beginning of a particular kind of connection.
He became the soundtrack basically of my life. I remember the rest of my time in high school as all Phil Collins.
Eventually, Garen graduates. He moves to LA with dreams of making it in Hollywood. You know the drill. Casting call after casting call, waiting for that big break.
It started for me with an open call for a film in the LA Times, and the ad just said they're looking for actors with gymnastic background, dancers, physical performers.
He shows up to the audition in a big dance studio with no idea what he's trying out for.
They had mats and scaffolding set up, and there was a British guy who turned out to be our trainer, and he gave us a little routine to do as a chimpanzee. So that was like the first I found out this is for some kind of ape thing.
More auditions follow, and finally, 6 months later, he books his first major part. Garen will be playing a gorilla in a big-budget adventure movie called Congo.
We went through 5.5 months of training to be a gorilla, just staying in character, being a gorilla for all the time. It was just very, very intense.
After Congo, more opportunities follow, all of them inside a gorilla suit that's beginning to feel like a second skin. Before he knows it, Garen has carved out his own little niche in Hollywood.
It worked out great for me later on because after 8 or 9 years, I think they started renting the suit for commercials. So I started doing a lot of commercials.
Can you see where this is headed? Isn't fate a funny thing? One day, Garen's agency calls
and asked me if I played the drums. And I'm like, no, I don't play the drums. And they're like, well, there's a commercial and we need you to play the drums.
The producers book Garen a drum instructor. It's only when he arrives that he discovers what song he'll need to learn.
And that song is one of the best songs in the history of music, in my opinion, and meant a lot to me and moved me and inspired me from the time it came out.
So Garen heads into his training, completely determined to do this job justice.
They wanted me to really be kind of exaggerated, so I'd take the gorilla arms and I'd wear the hands so I could feel what it's like to hold the sticks and really pound on the drums.
After a month of intense training, Garen flies to London to shoot the commercial. It's now or never.
I'm in the suit and everybody's there. I had headphones and really got to get into the world of the music, and I just had them crank it super, super loud in my ears.
When you watch the finished advert for Cadbury's chocolate, one of the most famous to ever air in the UK, you can see Garen's emotion in his every movement. That connection between him and the music is there in every frame. It's something that he'll carry with him always.
Anytime I hear that song, it's everything about my life coming together. It's a big thing for me to hear that song, and I never get sick of that song. Never. It's too important to me.
From that Surrey bedroom to a restaurant in Fort Collins to eternal life on TV screens and social media feeds. I'll say it again. Isn't it strange, the journey a song can take? I'm Zoe Ball, and from BBC Sounds, this is Era's Phil Collins. Episode 4, Against All Odds. Now, speaking of surreal turns of event, here's one for you. It's July of 1988, and Phil Collins is watching Michael Jackson at Wembley in the company of the royal couple, Prince Charles and Princess Diana.
And he, somewhere during the concert, Prince Charles turned around to me and said, "I'd like this music at my party, this kind of music." So I said, "Certainly, sir." He said, "Would you organise that?" So I went home having to organise Prince of Wales's 40th birthday.
The centrepiece of the evening was to be a performance of his own material.
We had a sound check at Buckingham Palace. All the road crew had their top hat and tails on. And it was the largest gathering of royalty since the coronation. Everywhere there was the king of somebody or the queen of something. And then I came out and did my half hour, and Elton was there. And everywhere you looked was people you recognised, you know. It was this extraordinary night. I introduced myself to the Queen. I went up and said, "Your Highness," which is supposed to be "Your Majesty." "Your Highness, excuse me, but I won't get a chance to meet you if I don't say hello. I'm Phil Collins." "Oh, Phil Collins, how are you?" It was lovely. A moment I won't forget. And also seeing her jive to Rock Around the Clock is something I won't forget either.
1, 2, 3 o'clock, 4 o'clock, rock.
It was only a few years later that the evening began to take on a slightly different aspect in Phil's memory. At the time, he'd chosen his set list based on the limitations of playing with just one other musician.
You call me from the room.
I put together a song list of mainly ballads, and I was singing Separate Lives and Doesn't Anybody Stay Together Anymore, and, what I found out later to be completely inappropriate song for a couple that were just about to divorce.
At the beginning of the 90s, Phil will watch, along with everyone else, as the breakdown of Charles and Diana's marriage unleashes a media frenzy. What he won't understand until later is that he'll be subjected to the same mistreatment. An idea that would have sounded ridiculous at the tail end of the 1980s, when Phil Collins enjoyed a reputation as one of the most level-headed men in music.
I was going to ask you how you keep your feet on the ground, because you've had an enormous amount of success, a great deal of adulation that goes with it.
Yeah. Well, I live a very simple, pretty ordinary life, and a lot of people wouldn't. No, I do. I mean, I get stuck in with the nappies, and I wash up. I push the cart around the supermarket.
The privacy bit, that's a problem, is it?
Well, I live on the main road, and it's silly, really. But I do get people sort of 10 o'clock at, I thought you lived here, Phil. We had a bit down a pub, and they reckon I wouldn't do it. Any chance?
It doesn't make you want to run to a Caribbean island and just live there on your own?
Yes. No. No, it doesn't really. No, I mean, it's part of it, and I don't mind that at all.
Try asking that question of Phil again a few years later, and you might get a different answer, because Phil's about to experience a different side to public attention.
I mean, you're monogamous, really, aren't you, on the whole?
Yes.
Twice married, nevertheless.
Twice married, yeah. Well, I've always been a sort of a one-woman guy, really.
This Desert Island Discs interview was recorded in 1993, at the time of the release of Phil's new solo album, Both Sides.
What about your most recent album, Both Sides? Because that seems very much to be about loss and longing and about somebody.
Yeah. Well, I suppose as you get to the halfway mark in your life, you start looking back as much as looking forward, And there are always going to be the little skeletons in the cupboard. There are always going to be the people that, if you start thinking about them, or if without even wanting to, you can have a dream one night and suddenly it's like this person you haven't thought about for 15, 20 years, suddenly you think about, and for 2 weeks you can't think about anything else.
So your wife has to be pretty long-suffering, is she?
Yes. She's amazing, actually. I mean, she knows it's what I do. I mean, I have to write about what I am, what I feel.
And perhaps what Phil Collins felt at the dawn of the 90s was a bit lost. In 1991, Genesis had returned with another massive album, We Can't Dance, topping the charts in the UK and selling 4 million copies in the US. But in the background, a personal crisis loomed. On the giant tour that followed, Phil Collins was reintroduced to an old girlfriend from his days at stage school.
This was a school romance that hadn't been laid to rest. And unfortunately, it kind of rocked the foundation of my marriage.
When Phil returned to his family from that tour, his conscience weighed heavily on him.
Things happened on the We Can't Dance tour. It started to go funny. And then I came back to finish the record, and we tried to make things right. But it was never the same again.
Could have given you everything that you need, but I cannot turn back the years.
Both Sides was a deeply personal record, one that Phil created without the help of any outside musicians, playing every instrument on the record himself. The album reached #1 in the UK, but Phil's private life was in turmoil. His marriage had never recovered from the events of the We Can't Dance tour.
You couldn't find a less promiscuous bloke on the road than me. I mean, if I'm married and got a relationship, I'm married and I've got a relationship. It's only when things go wrong, the blinds start to come down and you start to think, well, I'm just not happy, and things happen.
On the road, touring his new album in Switzerland, Phil met a woman called Oriane and fell deeply in love. But the subsequent breakdown of his marriage to Jill would prompt the single biggest scandal of his career.
What happened was I had split with my second wife. Her and I had discussed this because I was away on tour, but we had discussed this over the phone. We discussed this face to face, but then I have to go away. And then I remember distinctly that there was in Frankfurt in Germany, I was just about half an hour from going on stage and I was trying to call to arrange to meet Lily, our daughter. And the phone kept going down. So I wrote a fax and sent it from my dressing room. And that was the one that turned up on the front page of The Sun.
Somehow, the tabloids got their hands on the message that Phil sent Jill and ran with a story that he had broken the news of the divorce over fax.
I remember waking up in this hotel in Switzerland and it was there. And I thought, how the fuck did that happen? I mean, not only literally how did it happen, but why? I mean, it's not true, but at that point, they were starting to carve on my headstone, he divorced his wife by fax. And it will be there now forever. And no matter how much I try to tell the true story, because the other story is better.
For the first time in his career, Phil really saw the other side to fame. He was being hounded by the press, and worse still, so were his family.
Jill was in a terrible state. Lily was only 5 and she was trying to go to school and they were camped outside the school. They were camped in the garden in England. It was terrible. And anybody that's been through that in the papers, and I'm certainly not the only one, am I? I mean, will tell you that it's just, you don't think it's ever going to end.
The media dubbed the episode Faxgate. With it, Phil's tenure as rock and roll's #1 nice guy seemed to be over.
Well, I never liked being Mr. Nice Guy in the first place, so there's probably a happy medium somewhere. I'm not the cad they think I am, and I'm not the nice guy they thought I was.
After the bruising experience at the hands of the media and the end of his marriage, Phil moved to Switzerland, both to be nearer to Oriane and further from the papers that were hounding him. For the first time in his career, Phil pulled away. When he returned in 1996 with a new solo album called Dance Into the Light, it became his first not to crack the top 20 in the States. It was also at this point that he made one of the most pivotal decisions of his career. After 26 years playing in the band and more than 2 decades as its frontman, Phil Collins departed Genesis. A decision made all the more difficult by his friendship with Mike and Tony.
They are my mates, yeah. I've spent 25 years of my life with them. But the thing is that, I wanted to do other things. I wanted to do nothing. I moved to Switzerland because I fell in love with a lady that lived in Switzerland, and we're still together and we're very, very happy. And I live there and they live here. So I can't possibly, it wouldn't have worked anyway, really, in some shape or form. And as you get older, your interests change a little bit.
For the first time in his adult life, Phil Collins stepped off the treadmill of constant recording and touring. He reconnected with the reasons he'd got into this gig in the first place, launching a long-dreamed-of big band project with Quincy Jones. And in 1999, lending his talents to Disney to compose the soundtrack for Tarzan.
So You'll Be My Heart, for me, was a pivotal moment in my life in some respects. And I really lifted my game, to do that music. Disney music is like, if I mess it up, I'll be the one that messed it up.
And it says everything about Phil Collins, that even in this period of relative retreat from the industry, he was still breaking milestones.
To win an Oscar for You'll Be In My Heart must have been a wonderful moment.
Of course, being British as well, I just didn't think it was going to come my way. I'd been nominated 3 times and it hadn't happened. So when Cher opened the envelope and read my name out, it was one of the highlights of my musical career, I think.
In 2002, Phil released Testify, his first album in 6 years. And while it didn't quite reach the commercial heights of his earlier albums, it did document one of the happiest periods of his life. In 2001, Oriane had given birth to a son, Nicholas. And in 2004, they were joined by Matthew. This time, Phil would be around for every moment of his family's new life. And even if he wanted to, Phil couldn't continue to work in the way he once had. After a lifetime of touring, his body was beginning to show the wear and tear.
Happened one day in Los Angeles, actually. I had Lily and me, we were sort of playing a game on TV or something, and suddenly, it's called sudden deafness. I was quite philosophical about it, actually, I must say, but I thought, OK, well, that's me sort of slow down a bit. All right, mate, all right, I will. But slowly the brain adjusts, and then suddenly, although you still can't hear, but the perception is that you can get by. So at that point, I decided, well, would it be nice, rather than to have done your last tour without knowing it, it would be nice to go out and say goodbye properly.
With a final farewell tour, Phil Collins announced his retirement. He wanted to go out on his terms. He played to some of the most passionate crowds of his entire career, but it came at a tremendous personal cost.
Well, I retired to be with the kids, to be dad. But really, during that whole first final farewell tour, my marriage broke, started to splinter. And suddenly, I wasn't living with them anymore.
In 2006, Phil went through his third divorce. This time, there would be no mining the heartbreak for material.
I don't think the world needs another Phil Collins divorce record.
Instead, he filled the space by returning to Genesis. In 2007, the band got back together. As Mike Rutherford remembers, the tour was about saying goodbye properly, and it was filled with awe-inspiring moments.
That show in Rome we did at Circus Maximus, the last European show, is one of my memorable shows. 500,000 people on a summer's evening in Italy. The Vatican's background, and we played great. It's a great moment, just 5 of us on stage, and it just worked.
But this tour too would come with a price tag.
It was on one of the Genesis reunion tour, and Los Endos, we used to do a drum duet on each tour. And just one night, I just was losing power and grip in my left hand. And I thought it would just get better, but it didn't.
That loss of feeling in his hand announced the beginning of a painful journey, one that would eventually leave Phil Collins unable to play the drums at all. In the wake of that Genesis tour, he returned to Switzerland and found himself facing a new problem.
I mean, I had plenty of time because I had no work. Then I was, didn't have a family living with me. And then they, within a year, decided to go to Miami because Oriane had remarried and her husband didn't like Switzerland, and they decided to go to Miami. So then I had a huge void in my life. Plus, I felt like I owed myself. I'd never stopped. So I felt like, if I want to go and sit and watch cricket at 11 o'clock all day and have a drink, I'll do it, all right?
The years that followed were not easy ones. Phil's struggle with alcoholism took a heavy toll on his health and his relationships. It was a struggle that his scores of fans knew nothing about until 2016, when Phil released his memoir, Not Dead Yet. And its release coincided with a very unexpected and very welcome announcement.
So suddenly you've decided you're back. You're going to do shows next year at the Albert Hall. They sold out in about 15 seconds. It's pretty good, isn't it?
Yes, very good. I was very impressed with that. Very pleased.
In the years since he'd last performed, Phil's physical condition had only worsened, so he wouldn't be able to sit behind the kit. So the question was, who might be able to fill the drum stool? Enter Phil's second youngest boy, Nick Collins.
Some of my earliest memories are from his final farewell tour in 2004. So I had the understanding from an early age that he did this for a living. I mean, it gave me the bug of wanting to play music for the rest of my life. And, I'd have a kit backstage. I must have driven him and the rest of the band insane because they would have just finished a 2.5-hour show. And I was just wailing on the drums backstage, trying to replicate what I had just heard.
Since his dad's retirement, Nick had wondered if he'd ever see that side to him again. He knew his dad had overextended himself back in the day, that his success had come at a cost. But maybe this time round, it could be different.
And I think at that point, all of us, and not just my brother and I, but all my other siblings, we were all happy to see him back on the road because he belongs on a stage.
The Not Dead Yet tour kicked off in Liverpool in 2017, with Nick joining his dad on stage to play the drums. No pressure, Nick.
And I remember just being like, oh man, this could go sideways. It's the first show back in, 13 years of his solo thing. And it was my first show on the tour. And I just remember him talk about rising to the occasion. It was even more than that. It was that was the first time that I really sensed oh my God, this guy's just got a switch that he just can turn on and then it's there.
The Not Dead Yet tour eventually encompassed 97 shows around the world to packed-out crowds of adoring fans. After it ended in 2019, it was followed by a similarly triumphant final Genesis tour, again with Nick at the drums.
You know, he'd come by the side of the drum riser on some of the instrumental bits. And at first I was like, oh God, what is he going to critique me on afterwards? And actually he just kind of wanted to just be there. Once I figured out that he wasn't sitting there to judge me, it was a really nice moment every show when he'd sit there. And having that kind of unspoken moment between each other was really nice. And I'm grateful that he felt confident enough in my ability to go on stage with them and to play these parts.
When that tour wrapped up in 2022, it really did feel like an ending. Mike Rutherford.
And it was kind of strange. I remember thinking, I've got a set list, say it's 15 songs, whatever it is. And I sent it down and thought, there's only 3 more lines to go. And it's kind of sad. When things stop, it's always a bit sad when things stop, but they have to stop.
Saying goodbye is always sad, but the final tours gave Phil something unbelievably powerful.
There's no way he couldn't have been blown away by the reception that he got every night. You know, you'd see kids and then you'd see old people, but then you'd see like young kids who were there. And it's the blessing and the curse of musicians and artists is that you're kind of always seeking validation. You've spent your whole life where success means people have turned up to the show. And so to not have that for a lot of time, it must kind of weigh on the mental side, you know?
And it was only now, in the final act of his incredible career, that Phil was being offered the one thing he'd been denied at the peak of his fame: a fair analysis of the power of his songwriting. Music writer Kate Mossman.
I think about 10, 15 years ago in music, something really important happened, which was that the idea of the so-called guilty pleasure was overturned. And anyone who talks about having guilty pleasures now looks like a fool, because there's no shame at all in admitting that you like ABBA or that you like the Bee Gees. And the key with an artist like Phil Collins is the sheer number of hits that spoke to all areas of life of ordinary people in the 1980s. There would be your wedding song, there would be your breakup song, there would be your storming down the motorway in your car song. Roger Taylor from Queen once described it as the wallpaper of life. And you can't deny that this is somebody who had a solo career on a level with Elton John or Billy Joel in the 80s, and there weren't that many other people that you could compare it to, where it just sort of spoke to the lives of ordinary people. And ultimately, they were the ones buying the records, they were the ones keeping these guys in coin, and they were the ones turning up to the gigs.
Suddenly, Phil's influence was everywhere. He was getting name-checked by artists like Alicia Keys.
You know, this new album, it's true, I was listening to a whole different style of music. You know, I was listening to a lot of Genesis, I was listening to a lot of The Police, Talking Heads, you know. Like
all the bands I like, they're all the sort of rock bands that I like. Maybe they got some affinity to people who like soul music, because a lot of Americans say, I like a bit of Phil Collins,
yeah.
I like Fleetwood Mac.
Yeah, no, because it is. It's heartfelt. You know, it's heartfelt. It's untraditional. You know, it's different. I mean, the fact that when you listen to Genesis that you hear those live drums and then those program drums will just come out of nowhere for like 8 bars and then never come back again. It's like it's experimental.
The UK R&B legend Craig David feels the same way. For him, Phil is a soul singer, pure and simple.
His heart is so deeply, from my perspective, entrenched in soul music and in R&B. It's like it's so natural for him in the melodies that he chooses to use, his songwriting ability, which I think is like, we have to highlight how incredible he is as a songwriter.
Craig got the opportunity to meet Phil not that long ago.
And I was just, man, to be in the presence of greatness, I was just in awe of the talent, what Phil means to music. So, but then putting that aside, just to meet a beautiful human being who had time to speak to me, to be in the presence of him, and for him to be so kind, and for him to sit with me and just talk about life, I just felt that for me was a really defining moment and almost kind of encapsulated who Phil Collins really is. Like, he's a beautiful human being.
Almost of its own accord, Phil's influence has spread far and wide. He may not be able to play the drums anymore, but there's a whole universe of drummers who followed the path that he forged. Drummers like Izzy Lamberti, who often covers Phil's tracks for her millions of followers on TikTok and Instagram.
The first time I kind of knew about Phil Collins, I was really young, and it was actually from Tarzan. I mean, I loved the movie. Like, I grew up listening to the whole soundtrack. Like, my mom would play it in the cars, like anywhere we were going, we'd listen to Tarzan. So that was my first encounter. But I think once I was like 10, I was getting really serious, and that's when I knew, In the Air Tonight, when I like really started researching and becoming a serious drummer. I was around like 10 years old, and I was like, I heard that fill, and I'm like, oh my God, I gotta play this. And I'm like putting together like, oh my God, that's the guy from Tarzan. He's a drummer. That's even better,
Phil's contribution to music is something that Izzy and others in her generation don't take for granted.
I just want to say thank you. His work on the drums and just as a musician speaks to not only me, but speaks to so many people. He's so inspiring, and I'm just honored to have learned so many things on the drums that he doesn't even know he taught me or generations of people. So it's just amazing. So thank you.
All of which must feel novel to a man who never really stopped thinking of himself as a drummer who sings a bit, a reluctant icon who, in his own way, broke all the rules of pop stardom. Bob Geldof.
I remember when the Rats started, I was down at Gary's house, who lived down the road from me, and I said, listen, if we're serious about this, we've got to behave differently. And he said, like, what do you mean? I said, well, the guy next door comes along today and asks you, can he borrow a bowl of sugar? He's run out. You give it to him. I said, but tomorrow, man, he comes around to attempt to f*** off. You go, why? And I said, I don't know why, but that's just it, So that was the sort of situation. But Phil was never that. He loved the music business. He loved everything about it, And all is that Phil Collins, his character type, his lack of style type, his lack of side or guile would have disappeared had it not been for the huge talent, the songwriting, the voice, the playing, the sound. That's a hell of a package to squeeze into a tank top.
The reality is, there was always more to Phil Collins than met the eye. 250 million albums sold, 8 Grammys to his name, an Oscar. I could go on. But none of that really does justice to what Phil achieved. To put it in the simplest terms possible, he soundtracked our lives. And he did it without ever losing track of who he was.
I know this sounds weird, but I kind of view myself as a failure. And, I remember when I read this thing about me and Michael Jackson and Paul McCartney being, only 3 artists that have sold 100 million records on their own and with a band. And when I read that, I thought, well, no one told me that. Nobody told me. I mean, if I knew I was as big as that, I'd have been more arrogant or something. I didn't know, because you don't stop and look behind you sometimes and realise what you've done.
In the final part of Era's Phil Collins, it's time for the man himself to look behind and take stock of what it is he's done. Join me as I sit down face to face with the living legend himself for an all too rare and exclusive new interview. I can't wait to see you there. I'm Zoe Ball, and this is Era's Phil Collins. Era's Phil Collins is a Cup and Nuzzle production for BBC Sounds. It was presented by me, Zoe Ball, and written and produced by Frank Palmer. Executive producers for Cup and Nuzzle are Matt Everett and Graham Hodge. Our head of production is Sarah Garcia Anderson. Our production manager is Maxim Taylor. Edited and mixed by Alex Bernard and Hannah Armstrong. For BBC Music, the commissioning executive was Will Wilkin, and the commissioning producer was Hannah Clapham. If you're loving this series of eras, there's loads more to enjoy. For more music, archive and interviews from the Beatles, ABBA, Queen and Kylie Minogue, search Eras on BBC Sounds.